I mean, speaking of technologies, the technologies you're using are obviously, incredible for monitoring what's going on. What do you think about sort of cloud seeding and people introducing these technologies where they think they can solve the catastrophic effect of climate change rather than actually address this, address the cause in the first place?
I think solve is, I think, an overused word in that respect. They may be able to do something, perhaps, but I don't think anyone seriously expects that by putting iron filings into the ocean to try and stimulate CO2 absorption by the ocean. That's one thing which is being proposed. Nobody's quite clear how long that CO2 would reside in the ocean anyway, so perhaps even if it does work that you do absorb more CO2, then perhaps fine for a short time, but then it just is released afterwards anyway. So really that's on the edge of what we think might be possible or useful to be done. I think we're more talking earlier about the politics. I mean, we're very much away with nothing to do with us, thank goodness we can stay away from that. But what we would like to be able to do is to provide the sort of basis for information and reporting. If we take something like RED, for example, there are 32 different types of RED which are being discussed at present, 32 different varieties that different countries have put forward. Or maybe they'll come to no agreement on that and some other cap and trade mechanism. Whatever it is, I would just like to say that if you, by all means, decide on whatever you like, that's your business, nothing to do with me. But how are you going to verify it? How are you going to monitor it? How are you going to validate any payments you make? If one country is going to pay hundreds of millions or billions or tens of billions of dollars, euros, pounds, whatever, to another in order to defer deforestation or prevent deforestation or so on, if I were that country, I'd like to know that my money was making a difference. So there needs to be some objective, validated, independent mechanism for assessing the state of forests worldwide. And that's something which one can provide from satellites, for example.
Yeah, I mean, with RED, that was obviously not included in the Kyoto Protocol at all. So, and WWF have now said they'd like zero emissions from deforestation. Yeah. Why has it come into the Copenhagen Protocol? Why is it suddenly so? Well, it's obviously development in the technology, but what's...
It's not so much the technology. I mean, this is more of a political and a technical question. For me, personally, I would say it's because there are very few immediately detectable mechanisms and monitoring mechanisms which you can put in place. We talk about CO2 emissions as being the crux of everything. Fine, we can even measure CO2 from space. What you cannot measure is where it's coming from. That requires a better understanding of global circulation of the sources and sinks and the production of CO2. You can measure where it is now, but you don't know where it came from. So we can't base a trading system on CO2 per se in the atmosphere. So you have to look for surrogates for that. And one obvious and rather easily measured surrogate is deforestation. We know that if you chop down trees and burn them, then a certain amount of CO2 is released. That's easily calculated. So if we only take one aspect of it, that's nothing to do with transport or with man-made emissions from industrial emissions or so on. But just restricting ourselves to deforestation in this particular case, that is something which we can measure. So it's part of the problem, maybe 20%, not quite sure.
Can I just put these things in context? One is we've seen a very unfortunate resurgence of climate denial in the last couple of weeks. Mm-hmm. And these kind of data are a really important part of putting that in its place. Right? I mean, when you saw it in the World Meteorological Organization data released yesterday, I mean, the fact is you can map the changes in the climate over the last couple of decades, and being able to do that and being able to map the impacts is really crucial, because we just cannot afford to be confused about what's really happening. Mm-hmm. And the second thing is this RED question. You ask why it's important. I mean, deforestation, we now know, is 15 to 20% of global emissions, right? It's a big part of the problem. And we can, in fact, not succeed in beating this problem if we don't deal with deforestation. So finding a way to do it is crucial. And finding a way to actually know when you're successfully reducing deforestation is crucial. Mm-hmm. Going back to confidence, you need a way for Brazil, Indonesia, others to make commitments that can be verified. And that's in their interest.
But it's even I agree completely, but it's even more complicated than that. I've just been out in Kenya looking at some RED projects there, and you have to measure the size of the trees. You can't do it all from the from space. It needs actually on the ground thing. Now you can do that in certain kinds of forests without much problem. We just employ lots of people who take it around. But you try doing that in, I don't know, vast hundreds of square miles of Gabon or Congo or wherever it is, and then suddenly you're into a very, very different thing, and measuring and verifying in some of the most corrupt countries in the world anyway is potentially a complete nightmare. And my fear is that it is in the interest of some people to push through a red deal or whatever, come what may, as fast as possible, because it will provide potentially a vast amount of money to help the developing countries. But that money is very dodgy, and I hate to think how it's going to be abused.
Yeah.
Okay, here's a role for you. You said you've been looking for stories, huh? Now, this is a core challenge of this process, right? Is you have to come to terms with deforestation, right? So we need a red regime that will work, and it is, of course, a huge opportunity to channel resources into protection of forest, into conservation of forest, in a way that works for the communities who live there. But it's not easy, and one crucially important thing is we find a way to put a spotlight on the vagueness of some of the proposals and on what needs to happen to make it real, right? I mean, that we're clear about getting robust about these solutions. Because you're right, it's otherwise
exactly.
easy to get into sleight of hand.
I think we often look at the problem from the wrong direction. For me, the question here is, okay, if you don't like what I'm proposing, what else are you going to do? We have to find a mechanism. The critical thing is to ensure that in countries like Guyana, which has almost pristine coverage of rainforest now at this point, that we find a means to allow them to go through the next 5, 10, 20 years where they have a greater revenue from not deforesting their country than they do from deforesting it. Now that's the basic problem. How you go about that, is up to the politicians, so whether it's RED or cap and trade or some other mechanism, I don't mind. Once they've decided on that, I'm sure that if I were, as I say, forking out hundreds of millions of dollars a year, I'd like to know that it's making a difference. So I would like to see some sort of verification system.
But the thing is, we're going down.
We have a problem.
We're going down a
sidetrack.
We're going down a scientific route. We're going down a fantastically complex scientific route, which costs hundreds of millions of dollars to set up and organise and verify. Whatever. Actually, there's only about 30 or 50 large logging companies in the world. Well, just tell them to get out. Tell them to stop logging. You're the world leader. I mean, for goodness sake. I mean, put them in jail. But that's the problem, is that the politics gets in the way. Those logging companies are in cahoots clearly with the governments. The governments are funded by the logging companies. That's why you will get I fear you will get a weak deal, because it's absolutely in the interest of an awful lot of governments to have a deal with so many loopholes and so many things that business as usual can basically go on.
But you could regard RED as a much more cynical response to that, which is instead of being paid off by the logging companies, they're being bribed by richer countries not to do so.
Well, so I mean, let's be clear. There's no question a RED regime has to be robust, right? It has to be able to.
How do you make it robust?
Well,
it needs to know where money's going.
I mean, already we've seen in Papua New Guinea, we've seen in Liberia, we've seen unbelievable scams. We've actually seen a scam here in Denmark, I understand, as well. And I mean, that's just the start of it. I mean, it's like these guys have...
Do we all pack up and go home tomorrow?
No, but these guys have PhDs in corruption. I mean, they are serious. They can outwit absolutely anything that any legislators or negotiators can do here. They know how to basically steal vast amounts of money from under the noses of the poorest people. And how you get that, I have a terrible fear that although we will wave a thing and say, yes, we have got a robust scheme, frankly, we will not get it. And that's my terrible thing. In 10 years' time, we'll come back here and say, what did RED achieve? Very, very little, but it cost us a huge amount of money. And where did the money go? It went to the richest people.